we're getting swamped, if you like, by immigrants. And I think that's probably causing resentment. It's not a resentment which we can really express in public because, you've got, again, because of the threat that if people start talking about how immigrants should be chucked out and all the rest of it, and start differentiating between, the original inhabitants of these islands and this new wave of immigrants and how they should be expelled and all the rest of it. They just clamp down on free speech because they don't want to create the sort of disruption, if you like, of non-integration. A classic example of this is that Pakistani gangs have been raping girls in the northern towns for some time. This story has been sat on, is being played down. Various people involved with it, if you like, on the victim's end, have refused to have anything to do with it. Because we know it'll be a whitewash. That's the sort of thing that happens in this country. And it's the sign of a rotten state, I'm afraid.
Hey, welcome back to the show. And joining us today is returning guest, Alasdair Macleod, former bank director and strategic advisor at Von Greyers, whose work you can also find on Substack. Alasdair, how you been? Thanks for coming on the show again today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I figured we'd kind of, obviously I do this with every guest, kind of, if you can situate us with your kind of macro take as it relates to perhaps geopolitics, where society is at, and maybe tying it in with the financial markets as well. So we can just kind of get a holistic assessment.
Yeah. Well, geopolitics is very separate, I think, from, the economic problems that we face, though obviously they feed into each other to a degree. But I think if I can start with geopolitics, I'm really quite concerned about the direction in which Europe is going. The European leaders, and, we're talking principally the sort of leading lights, if you like, in Europe, who are Metz, Macron, and Keir Starmer, have convinced themselves that the Russians want to take over Europe or whatever. They seem to think that Ukraine must be saved. It must be saved from itself, must be saved from the Russians. The very simple reason that, the Russians have got to be stopped. And they have got this so incredibly wrong. It's actually dangerous. They've deluded themselves. This is the worst example of groupthink. If one wasn't involved with it, you would sort of look at it and say, this is an interesting exercise in how people can get misled by their own echo chambers. But actually, it's quite frightening. We've had, a paratrooper, or SES man, I suppose, who was killed in the Ukraine recently. He was an advisor. Well, yeah. There are quite a few of these guys. We've sent quite a few of these guys into the Ukraine. And, they're very much involved, which really puts us pretty much on a war footing with Russia if Russia decided to, take that view. She doesn't take that view. But on the other hand, when I look at what's happening, if you look, for example, at the attacks on Russian shipping in the Black Sea, now, the Ukrainians managed to get some success in that with intelligence from our spy planes. It is our spy planes, the British spy planes, which are providing target information. Now, if I was Putin, I think there's every excuse to shoot down one of those because they are in international waters aiding and abetting an enemy. I think it's fair play. We are playing with fire in this game. It is absolutely ridiculous. The fact of the matter is that the Ukrainians have lost the war, even with our support. I think if Russia actually escalated the thing now, the risk that, the Europeans would do something about it and all the rest of it, it's absolutely crazy because we haven't got the armaments in order to do it. The investment in defense spending is something that's going to take 5 years at least to get to the sort of level whereby we could defend ourselves against an aggressive Russian attack. We don't have it now. And I think that is actually a very important point, because strategically it means that Putin knows that he can escalate things against the Ukraine without there being any meaningful response from Europe. It'll all be talk, 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 talk. We're just not in a position to do it. Now, the other thing, of course, is that I think one of the things that's driving Metz, Macron, and Starmer is they're not popular in their domestic electorates. And, it's the old formula. When you're not popular at home, go out and do things outside against the headlines, and you're shown as a leader and all the rest of it. That's really what they're trying to do, I think. And that's part of the psychology. So this, to me, is actually very, very concerning. America has been vacillating on it. I mean, America started off, Trump was very clear when he started off. He could understand what Putin was saying. The red lines are, we want NATO out of the Ukraine. We want the Russian-speaking oblasts in the east. That's it. That's really all he wanted. He didn't want any NATO boots on the ground, if you like, in Ukraine. And that was understood at the Alaska meeting. It was made quite clear. And Trump really proceeded very much on that basis. But the ground has shifted under Trump. He's got midterm elections coming up, which I suspect has got something to do with it. He hasn't got the support, if you like, from within the American people to cozy up to Russia. Let's put it, that's the way it would be put. So, the ground has shifted, I think, in that relationship between Putin and Trump. And so Trump is no longer, if you like, someone who they can trust. And I think they've been misled in that. So the situation actually is quite dangerous. That's one hotspot. Another hotspot, of course, is the Middle East. Netanyahu definitely wants the Americans to bomb the hell out of Iran. And the Jewish lobby is just, it controls America. So don't rule that one out. That is for sure. And then you got Venezuela. Excuse me. I'm just getting over a cold, or just starting one, I think. It seems to me that someone in the deep state has taken the view that controlling the whole of the world is, no longer feasible. Fighting against the partnership of China, Russia with BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all the rest of it. You can maybe have a few skirmishes on the side, but the idea of actually maintaining control over the rest of the world, being, if you like, the single imperial hegemon, that is obviously a policy which is not working. And I think they've decided to restrict themselves to their own backyard, the Americas, North, Central, and South. They've already got Argentina, which under Milei has backed out of BRICS, with a very good reason that he needs dollars. So that's fine. They've got a few others going right wing. Chile was the most recent one. And I think the other thing is that, a lot of the fight, if you like, over Brazil, over the leadership of Brazil, that strikes me as being something like the Americans want regime change, and they're working on that. Of that I have absolutely no doubt. And then, of course, there's Venezuela. They want to destabilize Venezuela, get rid of Maduro. There is enormous oil reserves and all the rest of it. But I think that's secondary in the sense. That's just sort of, if you like, guilt on the gingerbread. The main thing is to control South America, Latin America. And, of course, China has got a lot of investments in that part of the world. So I think the battle lines are shifting. I think there's a realization that China is just too difficult for America to shift. She's got hypersonic weapons, apart from anything else, which the Americans don't have. So the Russians. So, America, I think, in terms of defense, it's old, it's old school stuff, not the new technologies. And that's the background, I think, to the global situation. Of course, economically, we think of ourselves as being the only people that matter on this earth. By ourselves, I mean G7, America, Europe, Britain, Japan. The rest of the world basically, live in mud huts and don't really matter. It's no longer true. The rest of the world is waking up. Look at India. India is developing extremely rapidly. And she's, in terms of her evolution, economic evolution, she's where China was maybe about 30 years ago. The technology and everything else is just marching on there. The whole of Africa is a great growth area. Again, there's one area there which there is, if you like, a bit of conflict in terms of interest between China and America, and that's in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. Cobalt is, one of the things there, which America wants. China is building a railway, I know, from the East African coast up through Uganda into the DRC in order to have access to minerals, including cobalt. The whole of this sort of economic situation has shifted very, very much. Now, we think that, our economies go into recession or whatever, and that's the end of it. No, not at all. What's happening is that these other economies, which including the nations that want to join BRICS, known as the Global South. I mean, we're talking about over 70% of the global population, which is industrializing at pace. It's very important to understand this. So while we can go to hell in a handcart, I mean, the rest of the world is doing very nicely, thank you. That, I think, is a very interesting background looking into 2026.
Well, you covered so many topics that I'd love to dive in with you.
You gave me a bit of an open question.
No, I know I did. You did, yeah, and that's exactly what I was looking for. Something high level. I just thought I'd comment that I think sometimes people, like your average Joe, fall short of being able to contextualize the world that we're in. And it's been very interesting, the Anglo-American or even the West in general, how it's been able to basically dominate the world for the past 500 years. And I do, just as a side wrinkle, it is fascinating that the British Isles, was able to take over much of the world, and you see English everywhere. And so I think it causes people to think like this is going to be the way it is for the next 500 years, et cetera. And people failed to remember that, civilizations rise and fall, so on and so forth. And I certainly think that Asia is obviously rising more and more. I've heard some people speculate that, like, I guess like Hong Kong is supposed to be like the next New York in the next decade. I guess the word that I hear people throw around a lot, which I think there's a lot of substance to it, is hubris with Western leaders, and definitely a decline on a myriad of different verticals, so to speak, with the West, economically, socially, et cetera. That explains for the situation that we're in, and I would love to, I guess, segue to your, you touched on Europe earlier, and I'm obviously over here in the U.S. I'm in California, and so I'm not obviously boots on the ground over there in the UK or in some of these other countries. But if you could provide perhaps the zeitgeist and your rendering as it relates to just kind of the people, the spirit of the people, and what you're seeing and observing out there, and where do you see the puck going?
Well, I think the economies in Europe are not as strong as the sort of macroeconomic statistics would suggest. I think there are two problems. I think one is that the economies are buoyed up by public spending. That is why things haven't sort of slid into recession. It's just public spending, deficit spending, which basically means a debasement of currencies. This is less obvious, perhaps, in some senses in the Eurozone, where you've got multiple members sharing the same currency. Less easy, if you like, to put a finger on things there. But if you look at Britain, we've got a left-wing socialist government. They got into power for the first time in 14 years, something like that. And they were out for revenge. They were out, basically, they're governing with malice aforethought against what they perceive as a class system. The rich should pay more. The rich actually shouldn't be rich because they have this sort of zero-sum game approach to economics. I mean, they are that stupid. They really are. They really think that, you've got resources in an economy, and if the rich have got the resources, then obviously the poor haven't. And that's something which you can correct by just transferring wealth from the rich to the poor. I mean, the naivety of these people is just staggering. We've now got into a situation where their earlier mistakes are really beginning to bite them politically. And consequently, I think that it won't be very long before she's called Rachel from accounts, Rachel Reeves. When she's as Chancellor, I think she's going to be out in her rear in the new year. I mean, she would have to be. I think the attacks on Keir Starmer are going to increase. I note that the most powerful backer of the Labour Party, which is the Unite Union, have now got a new female leader who's threatening to withdraw funds from the Labour Party because it's not left-wing enough. The problem is that if Starmer goes, he'll be replaced by someone even more socialistic. So you'll have incompetence replaced by, if you like, the sort of communist destruction that every communist government has wrecked throughout history. I mean, I'm calling this communist because you can't, you just put a thin cigarette paper, try and put a thin cigarette paper between communism and our form of socialism, and you can't get it through. The assumptions, the underlying political assumptions are exactly the same. This is a very dangerous situation, and I can see this country going downhill very, very rapidly. I mean, we actually had an admission from the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is the sort of independent financial watchdog which provides the statistics for the Treasury. This was meant to be so that Treasury doesn't mark its own homework, as it were. Important figures in there are now saying that, at the way things are going, we're going to have a debt to GDP of over 300%. By 2070. Now, I don't know why they say 2070. I think it's probably going to be sooner than that. But you can see the direction of travel. Now, shortly, there will be, if you like, a bond market crisis. Now, whether it starts here or whether it starts somewhere else is not material. The point is that tax revenues are declining at a time when government debt, is rising. Now, that cannot be sustained. So that leads to a debt crisis, which will be reflected in higher bond yields. I wouldn't be surprised to see the yield on something like a 15 to 20-year gilt rising to well over 15%, possibly even over 20%. I wouldn't rule that out. We've just had a cut in interest rates. And guess what? We've got a rate of inflation, which is currently, it's just fallen. Wonderful, isn't it? It's just fallen to 3.4%. These figures you can take with a pinch of salt. But with a target of 2%, the Bank of England feels, yes, it can cut interest rates because guess what? The outlook for inflation next year is that it will decline in the second half of next year. I mean, this is absolute hogwash. They've got no idea whatsoever. They don't actually understand why it is that the purchasing power of the pound is falling. They don't look at that at all. Anyway, so there is a crisis, I think, a European crisis, which is mounting. And if Putin actually does take the opportunity to kick Europe. And I don't mean by that actually invade Europe or threaten to, an all-out war or anything like that, but to take out European assets within Ukraine or assisting Ukraine, then I think Europe is going to descend very rapidly into a crisis, because it will then be not just an economic problem, it will be a political problem as well. Put the two together, and you do have a major crisis.
Would you say that this is a situation by design, as some have speculated on one side of the fence, as opposed to just pure incompetence?
No, pure incompetence is the answer. I mean, there's so many people, so many commentators who see this sort of stupidity and think, well, the only explanation is that there must be a plan behind this, but there isn't. It's a mixture of incompetence and no other option. I mean, the point about politics is that you've got to get re-elected. So, to hell with economics. What are you going to say? What are you going to tell people in order to get re-elected? That is the key thing. And in the case of the UK government, they've got a problem that ministers might be advised on a different course from the one they're taking, but they have to sell it to their parliamentary Labour Party, which is staffed with MPs who are elected specifically to increase welfare. So how can you get spending cuts past your own parliamentary party? You can't. They can't. I mean, this is so, it's a mixture, I think, of, the impossibility of doing anything on the one hand, and also just complete ignorance on the other. There is no hope. I'm sorry to say. And, you sort of, one of the areas where people think things are done by design, for example, is a restriction of private freedoms. This is a very hot topic over here now. Has been for some time. But you have a situation really where the automatic default of the permanent civil service is to increase control over the risks to their policies. And, if you've got, let us say, the Russian threat, and you've got cyber threats and so on and so forth, then you've got to control it. And that means restricting people's freedom. And then, of course, the Inland Revenue, our tax collecting service, isn't collecting enough tax. And there are enough people maybe, in a position whereby they can, dodge tax or, not tell the truth about their earnings, whatever, be slow payers. So the next thing, and this is going through now, next thing is they have access to your own bank account. They will access your own bank account and take money out of it in lieu of tax. That's the next thing. I mean, you think this is all something by design. No, it's all really by default. I mean, I think that's the key thing to understand.
And as it relates to your average person, perhaps over in the UK, and I'm saying this as someone who hasn't been to the UK yet, I'll say
you must come.
I'm sorry.
You must come.
Oh yeah. Well, it's kind of
it's
kind of embarrassing because I actually have a background in a pretty strong background in European history, particularly England. But I'll add that I've heard from some people that the UK is very socially stratified. Could you provide your thoughts on that, especially to those who are not perhaps intimately familiar?
Well, it is, but not quite in the way in which you might think. You've got the sort of, if you like, the traditional view that you have the aristocracy and you have the upper classes and all the rest of it, and they do this and that and the other thing, and then you've got the middle classes, and then you've got everybody else, sort of thing. It's not quite like that nowadays. I would say that in general, you can always find specific exceptions, but in general, I think there's a fair degree of integration between the classes. Where there is a problem, however, is in immigration. We've got huge numbers of immigrants in this country. When you go to London, and it's just absolutely full of, Syrians, Afghans, Muslims, if you like, as opposed to Christians, which is, obviously we were traditionally Christian. So we're getting swamped, if you like, by immigrants. And I think that's probably causing resentment. It's not a resentment which we can really express in public because, you've got, again, because of the threat that if people start talking about, how immigrants should be chucked out and all the rest of it, and start differentiating between, the original inhabitants of these islands and this new wave of immigrants and how they should be, expelled and all the rest of it. They just clamp down on free speech because they don't want to create the sort of disruption, if you like, of non-integration. A classic example of this is that Pakistani gangs have been raping girls in the northern towns. And for some time, this story has been sat on, is being played down. Now, there are two reasons for this. The first is the reason that I was telling you about, that they don't want to stoke up the sort of animosity between ethnic groups, if you like us whiteys and the Pakistanis. But the other thing is political, because this has all been occurring in constituencies where there are Labour MPs. And so this government does not want too much information going around in the press about how this is essentially a Labour Party problem. The Labour Party's been sitting on this one and refusing to do anything about it. It's now appointed a royal commission, I guess it's a royal commission, and they've only just managed to find a chairman to sit on it. Two previous nominations having decided to resign. Various people involved with it, if you like, on the victim's end, have refused to have anything to do with it because we know it'll be a whitewash. That's the sort of thing that happens in this country. And it's the sign of a rotten state, I'm afraid. So coming back to your question about class, if you like, it's not perhaps as traditionally, if you like, sort of publicized, the sort of, the upper classes and the middle classes and the lower classes. But the divide now is very much between those of us who are born and bred here and the more recent immigrants, increasing numbers of which have really no skills at all or are denied the opportunity to work, which is another problem. And this is causing quite a lot of chaos, in my view.
Yeah, I've had some people over in Ireland share with me the situation over there, and it seems like that was kind of like the petri dish. That was like the first kind of real taste of what was to come, or is still to come, so to speak. Now, perhaps what are some other things that you are following and that you feel is not receiving enough attention?
Well, the principal thing, which I think is really worrying, is on the economic front, and it's really the destruction of currencies. The rate of destruction of the value of currencies, in other words, their purchasing power, is accelerating. And this is what the gold price is telling us. It's not gold going up so much, so there's obviously an element of that. You can't separate out what's going up and what's going down in an exchange relationship. But there's no doubt that gold is front running a situation which firmly indicates that currencies are going to be in crisis in 2026. Now, that crisis will take the form of fall in purchasing power of the currencies. At the moment, that fall in purchasing power is in basic commodities. It will accelerate in that, and that will spread into manufacturing costs, other costs. consequently, this idea that interest rates can go down and bond yields will come down, forget it. Bond yields are going to go up, because if you've got a situation where the purchasing power of a currency is going to go down, then bond yields have to rise. They will, because otherwise the foreigners don't buy the currency and the currency continues to crash. All this is at a time when we have got a huge valuation disparity between the long bond yield and equity markets. Equity markets are more overpriced relative to bonds than they ever have been. I mean, it's, I put out a chart every now and then which just illustrates this. And the importance of this is that, a new rise in bond yields will basically pop the equity bubble. And the situation in equities, particularly in America, is really just like 1929 to 1932, when the S&P or the Dow lost nearly 90% of its value top to bottom. 10,000 banks went bust. The difference this time is that we're not on a gold standard. And what that means is that the purchasing power of the currency will crash, basically because the authorities will do everything they can to stop the equity market crashing, to stop, to stop banks selling collateral, falling value of collateral, stock collateral against loans. I mean, that if you look at the FINRA numbers, that's at, there's something like $1.2 trillion of loans through brokers into leveraged positions. You've got foreigners who own over 20 trillion of US equities. When that starts going south, they're going to hightail it. It's quite simple. So I see that as the real crisis. And it means that everybody's going to lose an awful lot. They really are. Unless they get the hell out of credit and have a pretty good slug of gold, silver, other base metals, if you like. I think they're very, very cheap. The mining industry, which is underowned, obviously is a place to go. But in a general route, initially they could be, even decent mining shares could be hit quite hard. But so I think 1926 is going to be a very, very uncomfortable year for everybody. And that's the thing that I've been really concentrating on to answer your question.
Yeah, it seems like we're long overdue, and I surmise that with the Western leaders, they're going to need some type of they're going to need something to serve as a means to galvanize society, and I think historically that's been some type of conflict boogeyman that you have, of course, have alluded to earlier on in our conversation. I think it looks like for the U.S. there's going to be some intervention in Venezuela, which I think is just absolutely erroneous. And I just think that the U.S. should not have the global hegemony, fill in the blank, that it does and has more or less, and is certainly waning. I think it's just invited so much. It's brought so much destruction and challenges, and I think that's also reflected in the immigration issues throughout the world. And over in Europe, right, the displacement that's gone on over in the Middle East. You mentioned earlier about the Zionist lobby in the U.S., and that's very alarming to me. And what's even more alarming is that you can't even speak about it, which is just absolutely asinine to me. And there's a lot of interesting forces and actors at play.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing about the Zionist lobby and the destruction of Gaza and all the rest of it, we are told by our politicians that we must regard Hamas as a terrorist organization, and therefore every Arab in Gaza is by definition a terrorist. Yet, if you go to any other nation, they see this as a genocide. So here we are trying to justify a genocidal policy, which it is, quite simply, by the Israelis, by the Zionists, I think it is. This is a Zionist policy. We must draw a distinction between Israelis or Jews, many of whom I know and have known, and I think they're wonderful people. We've got to draw a distinction between them and Zionism. Zionism is really the problem here. And it's Zionism which basically runs Netanyahu's government. It's Zionism that really runs America's relationship with Israel and supports her war policies. I mean, that's, to my mind, this is very divisive for the rest of the world. And this is why the rest of the world actually doesn't look at this with blinkered lenses and sees it for what it is. It's a genocide. That's what's been happening. I mean, you look at the pictures of Gaza, it's rather like the sort of, the wake of atomic bombs, in Japan, which ended the Second World War. Hiroshima and Nagasaki absolutely flattened. That's what the pictures look like. How can people live in that? It really is. I mean, the rest of the world call it a genocide, and we call it, this is justified because of the terrorism of Hamas. Come on.
Well, I completely agree with you. I mean, for me, my journey on it was, at least initially you'd hear people on the left talking about it. Okay, they were talking about it. But then you hear people on the right talking about an alternative media. Okay, but there is a certain cohort within the right that does not subscribe to that. So I thought, geez, you have a union between people on the left and elements in the right calling a spade, and then when you just do your due diligence, you're like, okay, yeah, if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Okay, obviously there's ethnic cleansing going on here. I just think it's crazy how Larry Ellison, his son, and a lot of these other figures are trying to take over, media platforms and censorship. I mean, heck, even my show, candidly, like there's topics I want to, dive into more that I think are fascinating. And I think there's a way to do it in a way that is, palatable and tactful. But you're at the mercy of these algorithms and these other forces at play. And and the distinction you made, I think, is so important. And you gotta love how people try and weaponize things and for their own initiative. Perhaps in light of time and such, is there anything else that that you are observing, or that perhaps other when you make other guest appearances that you're not typically asked?
Yeah, I think it's basically the big topics. I try and stay on the big topics because I think they are so important. I'm sure there are other topics, but they really pale into insignificance. Other than the ongoing Ukraine situation. We haven't talked about America's antagonism against China over Taiwan, etc. But I think that's actually a bit of a non-issue. I just don't see China trying to take over Taiwan. They will have observed that you can't just walk into a large country with a population which is unwilling to have you. The Chinese are actually pretty smart. They're not stupid. They rattle the saber a bit on Taiwan, yes, and they have this ambition, and they are determined in the long run that Taiwan should become a part of China. Fine. But if you look at Hong Kong, for example, why did Hong Kong lose its status as an autonomous region? Well, the answer basically was that the Americans provoked the Chinese into a situation where they had to do that. And I think the other thing you've got to remember is that, the Chinese Communist Party has a very, very different view of life to the one that we have with our governments. They have something like 40 to 45 different ethnic groups in China. who without strong government would probably be at each other's throats. That's why they have to have strong government. But equally, if you are, let us say, you decide that you want to do something in business, I mean, at almost any level, you're free to do that without being overregulated, so long as you keep your nose out of politics, so long as you don't bribe politicians, etc., as long as you don't try and influence them, because then you come a cropper. There is a big, big division between the state and the private sector. We've lost that. The state and the private sector are joined at the hip now in all our nations in the West. Businesses lobby government. I mean, you go to Brussels. I mean, Brussels is a very good example of this. You could go to 3 or 4 cocktail parties every day thrown by businesses trying to influence politicians. The lobbying is enormous. It's a huge, great industry, for goodness sake. What's the difference between lobbying and bribery? Bribery, I don't know. It seems to be quite similar to me. You know, our versions of democracy basically have devolved into interest groups. You know, various left wing or right wing or whatever it might be. You don't get that in China. China is actually, if you like, a model economy in many ways. The only thing is, you've got to stop having this sort of Western view that I have a right to, you know, to determine the political outcome, or, you know, the sort of Western democracy idea. Same is true in Russia. You don't do that in Russia. You do that in Russia. Well, if you don't do that in Russia, you could actually probably make a reasonable living. I don't know what the crime level is like. There were very strong sort of Russian mafias when the wall fell down. But, you know, in Russia, your income tax level is a flat rate of tax, 13%, 14% if you really earn a lot. Corporation tax is about the same as it is in most other Western countries. You don't have, you know, an enormous amount of regulation. If you come across government, you've got a huge bureaucracy. That there is absolutely no doubt. But they're freer economies than ours. And if you look at the Russian government, what's their debt to GDP? Under 20%, despite the fact they're fighting a very expensive war against Ukraine. You know, these are situations, I mean, the world has just gone upside down in terms of where it was maybe 40 years ago. So, which is interesting, very interesting. Anyway, there we are.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up, I guess if from a scale of 1 to 10, I mean, obviously, I mean, from what I've heard, it is mathematically impossible for the West to extricate itself from this debt crisis. So it looks like that is an inevitable. You mentioned 1926, which is a great, you know, tie-in with next year. From a scale of 1 to 10, how, you know, to what extent do you see that effectuating next year? I guess per se for question number 1.
Well, I mean, it's certainly mathematically possible to get out of this situation. It's politically impossible. I think I should make that distinction. I think that, you know, the peak in markets, we're very close to it in terms of time. And I suspect the whole thing will fall apart by the end of the first quarter next year, if not before the start of next year. I've seen so many times markets actually peak on January the 3rd. I don't know if that's a Saturday or Sunday this time around. But, you know, you get the sort of Christmas enthusiasm bit and newspapers, the media tipping this, that, and the other thing. So everybody rushes out and buys them because the Wall Street Journal says that this is going up, or this is the investment for 2026. But then, of course, there's no follow through. And then, you know, so that could well be the peak. But as I say, the thing that will actually pop the bubble, and it's a huge but great bubble, it really is. I think it's probably worse than 1929, actually. The thing that pops it will be bond yields beginning to rise again. That will be the nasty surprise. It really will.
Roger that. And then my last question, as far as a kinetic event, either in Europe or some other part of the world, maybe like the Middle East, I mean, where do you where do you see that potentially? Yeah, I guess I'll reframe that. Yeah, the likelihood of just kind of this collective kinetic conflict arising, I guess, from a scale of 1 to 10, for lack of a better phrase.
Well, I mean, I think we've got two principal areas which we had going into 2025, and that is Ukraine and the Middle East. I suspect that the Americans will want to have another crack at, egged on by the Israelis, they want to have another crack at Iran. And I think that's quite high possibility. And I think I'm sort of, I don't know, when it comes to Ukraine, as long as Putin acts fairly quickly to try and put a stop to all this stuff, and by that I mean win on the battlefield in effect, might require taking out special forces in Ukraine, acting for NATO members, or NATO communications over Ukraine, or assisting Ukraine. If he acts rapidly on that side, then I think he will reduce the possibility, if you like, of a conflict spreading. I think that's, for the first time, I think we can begin to see that. Simply because if he leaves it too long, the Europeans will be rearming themselves. I mean, he could take the view that, Europe is in such a mess economically and all the rest of it. I mean, we've got a big debate about, the $200 billion euros equivalent in Euroclear, which is based in Brussels, which the EU wants to grab in order to give to the Ukrainians. Now, quite obviously, this is theft, and Russia will go to court on this one. The Belgians are resisting very, very strongly. In fact, the Belgian Prime Minister, Bart de Wever, he was speaking in the Belgian Parliament on this this morning, and he's resisting very strongly. That Belgium should be have any part of this at all. But of course, what that does mean is that without Belgium and a few other member states of the European Union, the only option really is for the European Union as a whole to try and produce the money required, if you like, to support Ukraine. And that does mean that, various parliaments having to sanction this, like, our money being taken out, we're having to give our taxpayers' funds to support the Ukrainians. And at that stage, I think they'll have great difficulty getting it through. So, there is an argument that Russia merely sort of threatens to sue if €1 of their balances is stolen. I mean, at the moment, it's basically, because it's got frozen into Euroclear, effectively it means that the nations who issued those currencies have defaulted on their obligations. It's actually as simple as that. But to steal it, having defaulted on it, is takes it to another level. I mean, that really is very, very serious. So Russia, I think, could well try and play that game a bit, and just watch, the European Union just get tie itself up in knots. But I think, my view is increasingly that really, if I was in Putin's shoes, and he has come under quite a lot of pressure from time to time to be more aggressive, I think this is probably the time to get a bit more aggressive. Maybe, here we are in the winter. They've basically reduced by something like 80 or 90% power generation in the Ukraine. So it's going to be damn cold and very unpleasant for the population. And this is the time, I think, really, to step things up. And that can be done, I think, in such a way. They've got hypersonic missiles. I think he's under quite a lot of pressure to destroy Kyiv. I think he can do that with hypersonics. Yeah, I can see that stepping up a bit. Do it. I mean, America will, sort of scream and shout the odds, but I don't think America is actually interested in getting dragged into this anymore. And that's the problem for the Europeans. Anyway, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, it's a very
It's going to be very, very tricky, I can tell you.
yeah, it's a very unfortunate just conflict that's gone on for a handful of years now. Alasdair, how can people learn more about you and get in touch with you?
Well, go to MacleodFinance.com, where my Substack is, and do sign up. And I write, if you like, a relevant article on economics, geopolitics, money and credit, whatever, once a week on average. And I do a market report covering precious metals on every Friday as well. And I would hope that by subscribing, you might find it interesting.
Absolutely. Well, I love the content that you put out there and produce. Thanks for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts, even outside of the finance stuff. Kind of the politics going on, what you're seeing there out in the world. And have a Merry Christmas, and looking forward to having you on next year.
Merry Christmas to you too.
All right, you take care, Alasdair.
Thanks, Christian.
Quick ask: over half of you who watch the show regularly haven't yet subscribed. If you've enjoyed the show, you're finding value in it, subscribing is really the best way to support the channel. It's, of course, free. It literally takes 2 seconds, and it lets the algorithm know that this content matters. And of course, my commitment to you is going to be that I'm going to continue to bring on great guests, refine those questions. And of course, I'm always receptive to your feedback. If there's certain people that you'd like to have on, or certain questions, or this, that, and the other that you'd like to have as part of the show going forward, things of that nature, please let me know. I'm pretty easy to access. Anyhow, that's my commitment to you. If you can subscribe, that would mean a lot. Thanks.